Namaste, everyone. Can you hear me? Wonderful. So welcome to the Vedanta Life Academy on this Vedanta and Buddhism in Conversations, sharing practices along the path. This is something that I think is very exciting. We're going to discuss practices from both the Buddhist tradition and the Vedantic tradition. And we have two eminent speakers. So I'm really excited about today's program. Before we begin, let's start with the chant. And if you know this chant, chant along with me mentally. It's a classical Vedic chant. Om Asato Ma Satgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotir Gamaya Mrityor Ma Amritam Gamaya Avir Avir Maeti Rudra Yatte Dakshina Mukham Tena Mam Pahi Nityam Tena Mam Pahi Nityam Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Lead us from the unreal to the real. Lead us from darkness to light. Lead us from death to immortality. O Lord, light us through and through, and ever protect us with thy loving presence. Om, peace, peace, peace to all beings everywhere. So thank you all for being here. My name is Swami Haryanamayananda, and I'm the Vedantic minister in the Vedanta San Diego. Today, we have some really eminent speakers. So what I'd like to do is introduce the speakers, then tell you a little bit about the format, and we'll get right to the program itself. The first speaker we're going to have is Dr. Elon Goldstein. He's a Harvard lecturer in Buddhist studies and is a longtime practitioner and teacher of Buddhism. Although he began his practice in the Theravada and Zen traditions for the past 30 years, he has been a student of Tibetan Buddhism and currently trains in the lineage of the revered Tibetan Nyingma meditation master Tharthang Tulku Rinpoche. Dr. Goldstein has also teaches classes on meditation, the transformative power of Buddhist inquiry, and ways to newly envision Buddhist teachings for the present day life in America. He's a wonderful teacher. I had him when I went to Harvard. He is an encyclopedia of knowledge. I mean, there basically isn't anything he doesn't know. He's also what I'd consider, he's well trained in the Tantra tradition. He knows classical Vedanta. He's just really an eminent scholar. So I was so fortunate when he said yes. When I talked to him about this, he wanted to really emphasize more practices and what you can take home with you after you leave this class. So this is Dr. Elon Goldstein. Thank you so much, Dr. Goldstein, for being present with us. The next speaker we're going to have also after this is, most of you are very familiar with, is our revered Swami Sarvapriyanandaji. He's the Vedanta head minister of the Vedanta Society in New York and was at the Harvard Divinity School also as a fellow, as a inaugural fellow. And during his tenure at New York, he has become a popular lecturer worldwide on all aspects of Vedanta with a special focus on Advaita Vedanta. He's been a monk for 25 years in the Ramakrishna order, and he offers engaging talks on Advaita Vedanta philosophy, and his lectures are well attended from different universities. I mean, he's known as the YouTube Swami. From the Ramakrishna tradition, he's sort of the face of our tradition. He's our most popular speaker of the order, and he's given talks on TEDx series, and he speaks all around the country and world. So we're just really honored to have him. He's also probably the hardest Swami to get a hold of in terms of getting an event. So we're very fortunate that he's made time for this event. Thank you, Swami Sarvapriyanananda, for being present for this wonderful event. So just a little bit of what's going to happen. We're going to have Dr. Goldstein speak about the practices in Buddhism for about 25 minutes. Then we'll have Swami Sarvapriyanandaji speak on Advaitic practices for about also 25 minutes. And then what's going to happen is we're going to have them engage in discussion. So many times you'll find that we ourselves are asking questions, but wouldn't it be fun to see how great intellects would engage? So that's what we're going to do. We're going to ease in, listen in on their conversations and questions they have for each other. And then afterwards, we're going to open it up to a larger Q&A session. And I just want to make one thing clear, that you can ask your questions by putting the questions in the chat box. And at the time when we open up to Q&A, there's another thing called reactions. If you look at the bottom of your screen, it's an electronic hand. If you click on that, your hand will be raised up and we will call on you to ask your questions. All right. So let's have Dr. Elon Goldstein from our lecture at Harvard to present on Buddhist practices. Welcome, Dr. Goldstein. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Swami. Thank you so much. I'm going to try to share screen and get that set. Okay. Hopefully everyone is seeing that with the blue background and can still see the Zoom.
We do see it, yes.
Great. All right. So thanks so much to Swami Harinamananda. Thank you to Swami Sarvapriyananda for joining us and being here. And thanks to all of you for joining. Really a pleasure to be here. And as Swami was doing his intros, then it was occurring to me, all of these traditions, different Hindu traditions, Buddhist traditions, in one way or another, sometimes say that we learn through disappointment in samsara. We become disappointed in samsara. So after that introduction, at least as it pertains to me, be ready to be disappointed. But even as you're disappointed, then at least you can be learning more about samsara. So I wanted to start out by just saying a few things regarding how I see comparison and dialogue and what I hope to have happen by all of us being here tonight. I study different traditions. So even though I'm situated within a particular Buddhist tradition and practice very much within that tradition, I'll say more about that in a moment. In the past and present and into the future, continue to study different traditions. So I study Hindu traditions, but I also teach courses that are really comparative, where I'm looking at a particular aspect of Buddhism and then a particular aspect of Christian mysticism and meditation, and something from Islamic Sufi traditions, and so on and so forth. And this has been of great benefit to me, this sort of comparative view through the years. It keeps me inspired, but it keeps learning fresh for me in relation to my own practices, my own tradition. So I'd like to invite us to, we may have learned things, many of you are coming from backgrounds in Vedanta, in yoga in one way or another, or other Hindu traditions. And some of you may know quite a bit about Buddhism, but if we just remain open-minded and don't hold so tightly to what we feel we already know, then as we hear about another tradition, we can start to appreciate and look at aspects of our own practices in a new way, just through the comparison. And that can be really valuable, so dialogue and comparison doesn't have to mean that we're trying to figure out, oh, this tradition is better than this other one. And it surely doesn't mean that we need to switch traditions in any way. If you're in a tradition of the Ramakrishna order, Vedanta society, some kind of yogic tradition different from those, you already have a complete and good path. You don't need anything more. You don't need Buddhism. But by hearing a little bit about Buddhism, you may see some of the practices you're doing in a slightly different way, and they may come alive for you again in a new way. This has been my experience. And so I think that can be part of our aim. Okay, and the tradition that I practice within, I'll say more about it shortly, is a tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, Mahayana tradition of Buddhism that comes from Tibet. And in that tradition, the Nyingma tradition, or the ancient transmission, the greatest human teacher in the history of the tradition is named Longchenpa, and he lived in the 1300s. So I wanted to just share this quote. He says, "If realization does not dawn from within, dry explanations and theoretical understanding will not bring the fruit of awakening." Now, I'm not awakened. I'm a student of Buddhism and other traditions comparatively. And I find great value in these traditions. I take the practice seriously, hopefully not overly seriously, but I'm a dedicated student of these traditions, and I'm not a realized master. And nonetheless, I think we can get something from this quote, that it's easy in talking with one another to get into really abstract theory. And this is being said by someone who right now in my Dharma room, I'm literally surrounded by thousands of books. So I can easily get into abstract theory, but I'll be the first to say that's not what's most useful in my experience. And so if we can find things that come out of tonight that we can apply to our lives and actually improve our lives in some small way, then to me, what we're doing is worthwhile. So that's my wish. If you have questions from what I'm saying, you can email me. You might want to grab your phone and like take a picture of my email. If you're part of an existing tradition, be it Vedanta or any other, and you email me, I'm going to steer, in terms of practice, I'm going to steer you straight back to your tradition and say you should speak more with your teachers, more with your swamis. You should discover the deeper riches that are already there within your tradition. But if you have little questions about what I'm saying, I'm happy to try to answer those. So feel free to email me and I'll get back to you. And if you have friends who are interested in Buddhism, not for yourself, then I listed a couple of the places where I teach in a non-academic spiritual sort of way. Where Dharma College, the teachings are meant more to translate ancient tradition into a contemporary idiom without using traditional ways of speaking or traditional methods. And Nyingma Institute is, everything's done in English, but it's a little bit more of a traditional approach. These are related institutions. Okay. I put a fair amount of info onto some of these slides, and I do not want you to even try to read everything that's on them. I'm going to just gesture to a few pieces of info here or there, and if you really want this, then you can email me and I'll send you the whole slideshow for you to digest later, if you're really a glutton for some kind of punishment. So Swami already introduced kind of my spiritual background. And as I said, I'm a student, I'm not a master, but I have background in different Buddhist traditions. I also teach and study about a great variety of Buddhist traditions, but I'm going to be speaking from the perspective of one tradition because Buddhist traditions are different. They're very diverse. And to try to speak about Buddhism in general is impossible. Everything that I said, I would have to say 8 times in different ways because there would be, 8 or 18 different viewpoints. So I'm going to speak from the tradition that I practice from within, and that is this ancient tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. And in that tradition, I've had many teachers, and I've had teachers from other traditions of Tibetan Buddhism as well as other types of Buddhism through the years. I've been really fortunate. But within this Nyingma tradition, my primary teacher, his name is Tarthang Tulku Rinpoche. Rinpoche is just an honorific title, means precious person, precious teacher. A Tulku in Tibetan Buddhism means someone with deep realization, a woman or a man who has the ability consciously, intentionally to direct her or his rebirth in order to take rebirth to then try to benefit beings, not just be plunged at the time of death somewhere based on the momentum of habit patterns, the momentum of karma, but rather intentionally take a rebirth to continue to try to benefit beings. So this teacher at a very young age in Tibet was recognized as one of those types of beings by the people around him. I'm not going to talk all about my academic background. I'll just say this, that I did a number of degrees at Harvard, as well as a degree in education elsewhere. My training at Harvard was not just in Buddhism. And my PhD training was in South Asian religions. So that means a variety of Hindu traditions, the history of Indian religions, Jain traditions, Buddhist traditions, how these developed in dialogue. So I have this very long-standing, deep interest in other traditions besides Buddhism, and tremendous respect. I constantly learn from different types of Vedanta as well as other Hindu traditions. So with that said, I've already mentioned that Buddhism's diverse, so I can't speak about it as one thing. And I'm going to be speaking as a practitioner rather than as an academic. If you specifically want me to answer a certain question later on from an academic standpoint, sure, go ahead and ask for that. But otherwise, I'm speaking as a Buddhist student. And just to give you a sense of how the types of Buddhism break down, I'll go through this really quickly. There are many, many types of Buddhism in the world today. It has a long history, 2,500 years approximately. It's gone into different cultures of Asia. So, Buddhism begins in South Asia, India, Nepal, but it goes into China. It goes all throughout Southeast Asia. From China, it goes to Korea, Japan, Vietnam. It goes into the Himalayan areas, Tibet, surrounding regions, Central Asia, Mongolia, Indonesia at different times. What today is Pakistan, Afghanistan, parts of Iran. Buddhism flourished there at different times in history where it now doesn't exist any longer. The point is, in today's world, all of these types of Buddhism, we could talk about them in two classes, two categories. There's Theravada Buddhism, spelled with a, I'm down here, if you see my cursor, it's spelled with a TH, but it's just pronounced as a T. And that's the type of Buddhism that's predominant in Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia today. And then there's a different type of Buddhism where the ideas, practices, outlook really differ in many ways from the Theravada ones. And that's called Mahayana Buddhism. And that's the type of Buddhism that nowadays is prevalent all throughout East Asia, so the countries that I list here, and all of the Tibetan influenced regions that I list here. And a number of you are in India, so you and some others in the audience are well aware that there are now numerous Tibetan communities in exile that have been welcomed by the Indian people and the Indian government. The Tibetans are really fortunate in that way, and they have plenty of communities in India as well, right? Because the quick history is that Tibet was an independent country, and in the 1950s, the communist government of China invaded, annexed the country, and really destroyed most of the culture and made religion difficult or impossible to practice. So many Tibetans are now in exile outside of what was Tibet. And then about Tibetan Buddhism, again, really quickly, Buddhism starts in India, as we said, has a long history there. And in the late 700s, it is transmitted from India into Tibet. That's the first wave when Buddhism comes into Tibet. Long before that, it had gone into other countries such as China, Sri Lanka, and many other places, but it goes into Tibet rather late. And that first wave of transmission in the late 700s, that's the ancient transmission. That's the first transmission from India. And so that's, Nyingma is a Tibetan word. It means ancient ones, the ancient tradition, the ones who follow the first wave. That's the tradition that I happen to be situated in, but I am very familiar with all the other traditions of Tibetan Buddhism and derive benefit from those as well. So then there's a second wave from India into Tibet that goes on for a couple of 100 years. And that second wave gives rise to the other schools of Tibetan Buddhism that exist today that are listed down at the bottom. All right. So I'm speaking from this Nyingma tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. And the one other thing to say about this, since so many of you are situated in traditions that come from India, because Buddhism developed side by side with a whole plethora of Hindu traditions in India, as well as Jain traditions and other traditions. Because of that, there was ongoing sharing amongst Buddhists and Hindu traditions and Jains. There were debates, there were points of disagreement. So there were all kinds of interactions of different sorts. And because of that, it's natural to find some commonalities. And they were all speaking the same cultural language. They were working with many of the same ideas, these different traditions, and developing them in their own particular ways. So we will find lots of points of commonality between, say, this Nyingma tradition in Tibet, indebted to the Indian Buddhism, and Vedanta. We'll find especially really strong commonalities between points of overlap between this Nyingma tradition of Tibetan Buddhism and much of Tibetan Buddhism beyond that, with Indian, Tantric, Hindu traditions, and in particular, the Trika Kaula Shaivism of Abhinavagupta and his great disciple Kshema Raja. This is a particular type of tantric tradition that develops in the late 900s onward in India. Sometimes it's called Kashmir Shaivism because Kashmir was a particular stronghold for this type of tantra. But then there are really strong parallels between Tibetan Buddhism and that type of tantra. There are differences, but just to throw that out there because some of you may have familiarity with some of those things. All right, with that as background, I want to jump into practices with my remaining 12 minutes or so. So we've already said that that the tradition is thoroughly tantric. We'll try to see a little bit what that means as we talk about practice. The other thing about this Nyingma tradition is that it has always been mostly a lay tradition, non-monastic. So they do have monks and nuns, but the other Tibetan traditions have many more monks and nuns. And most of the great masters in the Nyingma tradition have been lay persons with families, with careers, with everyday work, raising children, earning a living, and doing this deeply involved spiritual practice. So there are some things to learn for those of us who are involved with all of that. You know, I'm a dad of two school-aged daughters and so on, so I can take inspiration from some of the lay masters. And then because this tradition, along with many other traditions that focus on a non-dual realization, a realization that is, in the final sense, beyond ordinary conceptuality, beyond the ability of language to capture the lived freedom that the traditions talk about. This is one of those traditions where it's certainly possible to live a freedom. And even at early stages of the path, even students can start to taste a little bit of that freedom. We don't have to be a grand master to taste a little bit of freedom and get a sense of what the tradition is talking about on a bigger scale. But because the deeper realization is a lived one, it's an embodied one, but it's not a conceptual one. It's not an understanding, the deepest sort of understanding about the nature of our being in this tradition and many others. It's not an understanding that we can just put into a sentence and say, now I've got it, now I own it. And that, in fact, would be a big trap if we were to try to do that. Because the realization is lived, but is beyond any particular conceptualization, there's a lot of room for innovation and creativity in how to present teachings. Because whatever we're saying is at best either clearing away misunderstandings that are getting in the way of some kind of deeper experiential realization, or in this tradition, what we're saying might be some kind of metaphorical pointer to a deeper experience. But what we're saying is not the experience in itself. that can be lived in our bodies moment by moment within the flow of time, but can't be grasped by the intellect. So therefore, words are helpful, words are necessary, words are very important, but there's also a lot of flexibility with words, right? And the greatest master of this whole tradition, the awakened being or Buddha who brought these teachings from India into Tibet, in one of his texts, when he's talking about the deepest realization, the deepest nature of our being, he'll say, some people call this the Atman. Some people call this the great self. Some people call the deepest nature of our being God. Some people call it this and that. Some Buddhists may talk about it as shunyata, or sometimes in English we'll hear that called emptiness, which is not a term that I like. But in that sort of a text, he's gesturing toward this flexibility that we're talking about something that's lived, that's extremely important, but the words don't capture it, and we don't have to get too hung up on words. Okay, so we can use that as our guiding ethos now. This is that master that I was talking about, the tantric master, primarily credited for bringing these teachings from India into Tibet. So he's an Indian master who's considered fully awakened, the highest stage of the Buddhist tradition, a Buddha, an awakened one. But an awakened one who taught tantric methods, which was different than the sort of methods taught by the Buddha Shakyamuni, whom you may think of as the Buddha from long ago, from like 500 BCE, different sort of methods. This was an Indian princess. This is the depiction of an Indian princess whom that master taught, who became fully awakened, who's very important in the tradition. So just an example, again, of women in the tradition having very prominent roles as teachers, as figures. In this case, this princess Mandarava is considered a fully awakened being whose blessings and transformative power are available to sufficiently receptive students today, that her presence has not diminished in any way in the understanding of the tradition. This is a Tibetan princess who's the most important disciple of that tantric master for preserving his teachings. Again, considered a fully awakened being, this woman, Yeshe Tsogyal. And these are pictures of so they're from the 700s, those figures I was showing, and now to the present day, this is Tarthang Tulku, who's part of a continual lineage transmitting these teachings. And just as in Vedanta, taught by Shankara, and other forms of Vedanta or tantric traditions, whenever we're dealing with a lived realization that can't just be gleaned from books, teacher and lineage is extremely important, because you can't get this just by studying about it. Study will help for sure, but it's not calculus. We can learn calculus if we really want to by opening a book, but this sort of realization requires a teacher according to the tradition. And so having a line of female and male teachers from the past to the present is very important, and it explains some of the emphasis on the teacher in these traditions. So this teacher, one of the reasons he's notable is because he is the longest residing Buddhist teacher in the West, anywhere in the West today. Came to California in 1968, and that's been his permanent home since. I mean, a few trips to Asia here and there, but really he's been there interacting for over 50 years with modern people from all over the world, Europe, South America, North America, Asia, and trying to develop ways to teach them according to where they're coming from. And so that's just one of the things that makes him a little bit notable. Okay, so now into practice. And so talking about practice, we start with a problem. I have only a few minutes left, so I'll be briefer. And the problem, according to this type of Buddhism, is that our whole life is beset with difficulties and dissatisfaction because everything that we're doing is undergirded by and pervaded by a form of misknowing. We're not properly in tune with the nature of our being, with who and what we really are, with what we mean when we're talking about myself, what that really means, with what our body is in relation to ourself, what our mind is, what the world is. These are all things we don't really understand. We don't understand how we got here, why we were born here. We may have ideas of where we're going after our death, but most of us don't have some kind of direct perception and foreknowledge of exactly where we're going after our death. So we're beset by all kinds of misknowing, and our actions are colored by this. Our intentions, our attitudes are all influenced by this type of misknowing, or what's called avidya, a term that some of you know. And one of the consequences of this misknowing is, speaking for myself, and I think most of us, we feel ourselves to be these small selves. You know, I have this self, and I have a body, and I have an identity, and I have things to protect. And the people who are close to me, they're mine, and I have to protect them, versus people who are not my people. You know, and somebody insults my hair, and now I'm all upset because it's my hair and my body, and so on. And this notion of ourself becomes the center of our world. And Mahayana Buddhism is certainly not saying, different types of Buddhism may say different things, but Mahayana Buddhism is certainly not saying that we're nothing, but instead is saying we're far more expansive than what we take to be our small little selves, that really we are an open type of freedom with all kinds of inconceivable, wonderful qualities of love and joy and compassion and responsiveness that we're normally not in touch with, because we're so fixated that we are this small sort of self. And that this is not just a conscious thing. This is very deeply seated within us. We can't just think our way out of it, right? And that from this holding on to a sense of a small self, then we have to get what we want. We have to keep away what we don't want. So there's this constant reaching out and pushing away. That's this exhausting dynamic of our lives, and all of the other negativities that we experience in the understanding of Buddhism arise from this, from holding the self, and then this wanting and disliking. So from that, we get cruelty, indifference, dullness, jealousy, whatever you want to name. They're all outgrowths of this. Okay. On a bigger scale, these negativities within consciousness built on misunderstanding, they grow into habits. These habits that we can call karma, these sorts of actions out of misunderstanding, they plant propensities or seeds, inclinations within our consciousness. So if I'm an angry person, I'm more likely to react in an angry way when somebody cuts me off on the road, because I've been practicing anger. The seeds are there. And so then the behavior gets reinforced, and this becomes a vicious circle. And this vicious circle is part of what Buddhists talk about when they talk about samsara, that we're spinning, caught. And they also understand that moment by moment, experience is reproducing itself, one moment leading to the next in a continuity. And so rebirth is part of this picture. But rebirth is not under our control ordinarily. We're pushed by these confusions and negative states, and by the force of our accumulated actions and habits, into some kind of new embodiment, new sense of a world. Here I am, like when we dream at night. How did I get here? Now I got a new body. Now I'm in a new world. And we just run with it in the dream, right? We're running from the monster suddenly. So likewise, we're thrown into some sort of new world, and this is what's meant by samsara. So in my closing moments, and maybe we can cover some of this in questions and answers, practice is to become free and to discover the freedom that's already there. So this is part of what's meant by Buddhahood or awakening. And that's done by treading a path where certain kinds of virtues are actively practiced. So if right now we are beset by negative conditioning and negative patterning, then in a conscious way, I'm going to wrap up in the next 60 seconds here.
Dr. Timolsina, Dr. Goldstein, I'd rather you spend an additional 5 minutes to go through the practices. Everybody understands that we have a rare opportunity today, so if we have to stay up a little bit, so be it. Because how often does an opportunity like this come? So please take an additional 5 minutes and please go over the practices. Thank you.
All right, sure. And apologies if I took too long trying to set the stage. But if we're already beset by negative patterning that we're not really aware of, we don't understand fully how the negative patterning operates, how it's driving us, or how to get out of it exactly, then part of the path is to very consciously say, we're going to work within patterning to create new patterning that's positive. We're going to work within conditioning to reprogram the system. So this is still within a programmed system. This is not a type of unconditional freedom yet that we're talking about, right? That if I am under the sway of the habit of irritation and impatience, then I'm going to work on that using various kinds of meditation methods and change that attitude and the way it manifests in behavior. And so the first 5 virtues listed here are all part of this reprogramming project that are part of the Bodhisattva path. A Bodhisattva is a being who's aiming toward awakening, aiming to try to become a Buddha. And why become a Buddha? Because there's freedom there for oneself, joy and bliss, but also, more importantly, or as importantly, there's the ability to benefit others. And also a feeling that there's no separation anymore between oneself and others. So benefiting others, benefiting oneself, the distinction doesn't hold at a deeper level. So becoming a Buddha is, in the Mahayana, is all about trying to benefit everyone, everywhere, without distinction. So these first 5 kinds of virtues that involve all sorts of practices are reprogramming the system. And the 6th one, insight or understanding, it can begin in a conceptual level, changing our understanding conceptually. But in the end, in this sort of tradition, this prajna or insight leads to a type of effortless, non-intentional resting in the deeper nature of what we already are. Because if we're to discover a freedom that's not produced, that's always already there, effort is not going to produce it. Effort may clear away what's covering over the freedom and what's causing our attention and awareness to constantly become lost and sad. Effort may help with that, but effort's not going to create a lasting freedom, because anything created cannot last. The lasting freedom has to be there already, So potentially in this tradition, this would be very, very rare, but just potentially it is possible to have sudden, deep, all at once realization of resting in our deeper nature that's always already there, our awakened nature. And many of you are familiar with the Upanishads and the Mahavakyas, the great statements that point toward realization. And this sort of all at once realization of, oh, I'm not this little self anymore. I'm actually a freedom. I'm not this body. I'm not trapped in this little world. I've never been subject to death. This kind of more ultimate perspective can be realized all at once, but typically there's a lot of gradual practice, decreasing the negativities. The negativities arise less frequently, less intensely, and the positive qualities start to pervade our experience. Everything gets easier. And then resting effortlessly in a type of freedom that's not produced becomes far more possible. Yeah. So the last things that I'll say, without going through all the details at the moment, are that as far as the phases of practice go, first, there's a real close look at our ordinary situation, how it's operating, how the mind is operating, how misknowing and negativities come into play. Where do they fit within perception, within the senses, within conceptualization? How are all these different aspects of our consciousness functioning to create our sense of being in the world? And then, having seen that, we can start to address the confusion and misknowing. And then the next stage is to really develop love, care, compassion, empathy with other beings. That's part of the Bodhisattva path. And then finally, there are these meditation methods that would clear away the misunderstanding in a type of effortless, non-intentional resting, right? Intention's always aiming somewhere. There's a somebody intending to do something and get somewhere. So that's considered very important all the way until we become fully awakened. We need positive intention. We need to think, hey, may this session tonight be useful. And at the end of the session, Buddhists from the Mahayana would say, we ought to do a prayer at the end of the session. Whatever benefit there is, may it lead us in the direction of deeper understanding and awakening. That sort of intention is vital. But if we think that that's going to get us to the ultimate's not something we can get to. It's not something that somebody can own, right? It's when we give up the holding on to the point of that there's a somebody and there's a something and there's anything to own, and we start to release that. That's these later stages of meditation that maybe we find there's a freedom we can inhabit. So pardon me for going over time, but we can maybe talk more in dialogue later. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Dr. Goldstein, so much for this wonderful presentation. Before we go on to Swami Sarvaprinanda, just Dr. Goldstein, in a very succinct way, how would you define shunyatva? You didn't like the definition of emptiness. How would you redefine it, or what language would you use to express it?
So in the tradition that I'm speaking from, this word shunyata is used to talk about one side of the ultimate nature of our being and the ultimate nature of everything that we experience and everything that appears. And the way that I would talk about it is insubstantial, unborn openness. That both the appearances that we encounter are spontaneous, uncaused, free. So this is a way of viewing things from a high perspective. From an ordinary perspective, in our everyday lives, everything's operating due to interdependent causes and conditions. Everything's interconnected. But part of that that's really due to samsaric consciousness. A deeper realization is an unconditioned freedom that's beyond causes and conditions. And from that point of view of an unconditioned freedom beyond causes and conditions, appearances themselves are free and unborn. So there's a way of viewing our everyday appearances in a non-conceptual manner where they're a lila, they're a play. Whatever is happening is a play of freedom, of the nature of freedom. And what is that freedom? It's an openness. So shunyata gestures toward an openness, that appearances are a type of openness. And then there's a type of openness that is formless, or where we think there's a solid identity to a person. But when we look more carefully, there's not. We think there's a solid essence to an object like a book, but when we really analyze it and take it apart, we don't find the bookness within the book. So that lack of finding is a different sort of openness. If we focus on that, it's like a formless openness. It's an unfindability. There is no absolute fixed essence there, but there's freedom, right? So when we look for the solid nature of things, we encounter an unfindability. That's a sort of, speaking very carefully, like loosely, that's a sort of nothingness, but it's a nothingness that indicates a lack of boundaries.
Thank you.
It's not a nothingness that indicates nothing.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Goldstein. Wonderful. Now, let us get into our Vedantic sadhana, and let us invite Swami Sarvaprinanji to give a talk on Vedantic practices, Advaitic Vedantic practices. Swami Sarvaprinanji, thank you so much.
Can you hear me?
We can
you
hear
all
you.
hear me? Yes.
Thank you.
And thank you so much, Professor Goldstein. So, I don't really have to be here because Professor Goldstein is equally an expert in Advaita Vedanta, also the tradition I'm going to speak about. And that's not surprising. He comes in in a very ancient and wonderful tradition of scholarship in India, where the traditional Pandits would be masters, equally masters of multiple systems. And to give you a concrete example, Phyllis Granoff is a scholar here in the United States who translated one of the most difficult books of the Advaita Vedanta tradition, which is the Khandana Khanda Khadya, which means basically, if it translates into the cookies of dialectical refutation. So dialectical refutation is cookies. It was written about 1,000 years ago, very difficult. And she studied under this Pandit, traditional Sanskrit scholar in India. And my teacher in Navya Nyaya, Professor V.N. Jha, he told me that he studied under the same scholars, the same Pandit. And the same Pandit was at the same time teaching the most advanced texts, not introductory level stuff, most advanced texts of Advaita Vedanta and the most advanced texts of Navya Nyaya, which is one of the probably the most intricate and sophisticated system of logic that existed on this planet before the invention of modern mathematical logic, symbolic logic. And the same person is teaching at the same time advanced texts in different philosophies. Navya Nyaya is a realistic philosophy, pluralistic, and Advaita Vedanta is a non-dualistic, absolutist philosophy, and teaching them so well that they lead to like PhD level work and production of new books. So that is a wonderful tradition of scholarship. Professor Goldstein actually referred to this at the beginning of when he said, know your own traditions and know other traditions also. I have come to feel that it's much better to know multiple traditions in depth and not hold on too tightly. Know it well and not hold on too tightly, rather than the opposite, which is much more common, not to know it well at all and to hold on too tightly to one thing. So the double problem is, one, it leads to fanaticism, it leads to all sorts of problems in the world, but also it is a problem in our own spiritual life. It hinders spiritual progress. I learned a new word today, misknowing. I don't know how many of you knew that. This is the first time I've heard the word misknowing, and with professor's permission, I'll borrow it because it fits in very well with Advaita Vedanta. Not that Advaita Vedanta is a misknowing, but the problem in according to Advaita Vedanta is that we have a misknowing of the world. The usual term which is used is ignorance, but ignorance somehow suggests you don't know anything, just plain dumb. No, we do know, but we are not knowing it rightly. So that's a great word, misknowing. I would like to share a picture with you, which I think sort of depicts this dialogue today. Let me see if I can share screen. Yes. Can you see this picture? You can see this?
Yes, we can see it. Yes.
So I was studying Madhyamaka Buddhism, the philosophy of the tradition which Professor Goldstein practices and teaches under Professor J. Garfield, Madhyamaka Buddhism in India and Tibet. And when I entered the class, Professor Garfield told me, Swami, keep your Advaita Vedanta outside the door. The two are different. Don't mix them up. And then when I went outside the class, and that day actually the picture was taken on the day I was returning from actually a visit to the home of Professor Amartya Sen, the Nobel Prize winner in economics, who holds positions in both economics and philosophy at Harvard. So on the way back, suddenly I met this wonderful, radiant Lama just outside Harvard Yard. And he said, what are you doing here? And I said, what are you doing here? Then we introduced ourselves, and he said, you are a Vedanta monk, right? I said, yes. And he, with a broad smile, which you can see on his face right there, he said, oh, it's the same. So, he's a teacher. And later I found out he's Lama Migmar. He's a Tibetan Buddhist chaplain at Harvard University. And if I'm not wrong, he's not from the Nyingma tradition. I think he's from the Sakya tradition or Sakya tradition. So one of the sister traditions to the one Professor Goldstein was talking about. So there we have it. The professor told me that the two traditions are different. Don't mix them up. And the practitioner, the Lama, told me, oh, they are the same. And I think both perspectives are important to keep in mind. I will take that thing forward when the dialogue, when we have the dialogue with Professor Goldstein a little later. Now, Vedanta. So we know that Vedanta is based on the texts called Upanishads, which are drawn from which are parts of the corpus of texts called the Vedas, which constitute, I think, the most ancient available religious spiritual texts in the world today. They go back, at least the Vedas themselves go back centuries, or if not millennia, before the Buddha himself. So 3, 4, maybe 5,000 years back. And the Upanishads also are either close to just before the time of the Buddha, or even maybe much longer before the time of the Buddha. The Vedanta literally means the final, the highest teachings of the Upanishads, of the Vedas. So the Upanishads constitute these final, highest spiritual philosophical teachings of the Vedas. And that's why they're called Vedanta. Vedanta literally meaning the end of the Vedas. End not in the physical sense, the last part of the book, the last chapter. Sometimes they are. The last chapter of the Upanishads are the last chapters of the Vedic Samhitas. But sometimes they are in the middle of the Vedic corpus, but they just contain the final teachings of the Vedas on matters spiritual. Now, Vedanta comes in multiple flavors, multiple schools. They have been interpreted variously. And so there are many, many schools of Vedanta. There's the one which I'm going to talk about, which is Advaita Vedanta. But there is also Vishishta Advaita, Dvaita. And these sound esoteric and weird, but you know some of them. You know them as the Hare Krishnas. You know, in New York, you come across the Hare Krishnas. They started off here actually, but they belong to a medieval school of Vedanta, the Achintya Bheda Veda school. And so Vedanta comes in multiple forms, multiple interpretations. But the one I'm going to talk about is my home tradition, the non-dual school of Vedanta, Advaita Vedanta. And when I talk about that, you will begin to see startling similarities, parallels with what Professor Goldberg was saying. You might also discern strange notes of difference with what he was saying. So again, like Professor Garfield said, they're separate, they're different. And like the Lama said, oh, it's the same thing. You will notice that again and again when I speak. What does Advaita Vedanta say? You know, Advaita Vedanta can actually, thankfully, be summarized very briefly. Professor Goldstein mentioned the Mahavakyas, the profound sayings or sentences from the Upanishads. Tattvamasi, that thou art, you are that absolute reality. Aham Brahmasmi, I am the infinite reality. I am Atma Brahma, this very self is that infinite reality. Or Prajnanam Brahma, pure consciousness is the infinite reality of this universe. So it can be said very straightforward. There is no two ways about it. It has been said again and again. And so there is no doubt about that, what it wants to say. But understanding it is another matter. When you start to unpack it, then it becomes pretty sophisticated, pretty subtle. And the unpacking has been done in commentaries called bhashyas. So Adi Shankaracharya, who came about 1400 years ago, he is a key figure in the development of the tradition called Advaita Vedanta. He wrote commentaries on the Upanishads, which is how we understand many of the Upanishads. He wrote commentaries on the Bhagavad Gita. So the Bhagavad Gita is also based on the Upanishads, being the teachings of Krishna to Arjuna, but firmly based on Upanishadic teachings. So Bhagavad Gita is a key text of Vedanta. Upanishads are the basis of Vedanta. And there's another text called the Brahma Sutras, which is sort of the sutra basis. One time in India, in the development of philosophy, It was the age of the sutras. So people started codifying knowledge, philosophical systems by writing brief, like equations or aphorisms in Sanskrit called sutras. And then there are a vast variety of texts written by Shankaracharya and his disciples, his tradition. They are called Prakarana Granthas, introductory texts, though some of them are not introductory, some are pretty advanced. They are standalone texts which give you a sort of synoptic view of the entire system or a part of the entire system, like Vivek Chudamani, like Aparoksha Anubhuti, like Panchadashi, many such texts. They're all in Sanskrit, written over a period of more than 1,000 years. And now we have Advaita Vedanta texts in various Indian languages and plenty of Advaita Vedanta texts in English too, which are translations of the original texts or in new works based on those original texts. So that's basically the literature on which I'm going to base my talk. But what I'm going to do today is not to attempt the craziness of trying to summarize a 5,000-year-old system. What I'm going to do today, just go to the source, something which will be nice, go straight to the Upanishads. I'm going to pick out one of my favorite passages from the Upanishads, which sums up the entire theory and practice, philosophy and practice of Advaita Vedanta. And I'm going to chant that passage primarily for my benefit, so it helps me to teach it, expound it better. But it's also nice to hear the sound of the original Upanishads in the original Upanishadic Sanskrit. And then I'll explain it quickly, in brief. And there are more detailed explanations available on online and in books. So that's what I'm going to do in the next few minutes. Go straight to the source, which are the Upanishads. The Upanishad I'm picking is called the Taittiriya Upanishad. And Shankara's commentaries are available on this, sub-commentaries and books on that. And the passage I'm picking is from the second chapter of the Taittiriya Upanishad. It's the first paragraph of the second chapter, Taittiriya Upanishad 2.1. All right, here goes. Here's the original Sanskrit from the Upanishads, then a translation, and then an analysis. Brahma vedapnoti param tadeshabhyukta satyam jnanam anantam brahma yo veda nihitam guhayam parame vyoman so ashnute sarvan kaman brahmana saha vipaschiteti. All right. Satyam Jnanam Anantam Brahma. There's a definition of Brahman in this. All right. So what does this passage mean? What I just chanted? I'll give you the translation first and then the explanation. Here's the translation. A very simple, direct Sanskrit. Brahma vidapnoti param. The knower of Brahman attains the highest. So when we hear this, the knower of Brahman attains the highest, questions come to our mind. What is this Brahman? And second question is, what do you mean by knowing Brahman? And third question would be, what do you mean attain the highest? What is the highest? What is the result of all of this? So 3 questions. And the next few lines, they answer these 3 questions and sort of set out the whole philosophy and practice of Advaita Vedanta. So the 3 questions. What is Brahman? How do we know Brahman? And what do we get out of it? What do you mean get the highest? Tadesha bhyukta. It is said in the Vedic hymns. Satyam jnanam anantam brahma. Brahman is infinite existence consciousness. Satyam, reality, existence, truth. Jnanam, knowledge, consciousness, awareness. Anantam, no limit, infinite. That is Brahman. Etymologically, the word Brahman means vast, just vast. Expansion without limit. Second question, how do we know this Brahman? In knowing this Brahman, you become, you get the highest. That's the goal of Advaita Vedanta. How do you know it? Yo veda nihitam guhayam parame vyoman. One who knows this Brahman in the sacred space of the cave of the heart, which Shankaracharya tells us is just a fancy way, a poetic way of telling us you have to know this Brahman as yourself, as I am Brahman. How do you know this Brahman? Not as, oh, that's God, or that's Brahman, or that's, the Big Bang, or, super strings. No, no, no. As I am Brahman. So it's a quest for, who am I? Self-knowledge, an inquiry into ourselves. And then the third question was, what do you get out of all of this? So ashnute sarvan kaman brahmana saha vipaschite. That the one who knows I am Brahman reaches, complete satisfaction, fulfillment of all desires by the very knowledge of Brahman. Simultaneously with the knowledge of Brahman, you reach complete fulfillment. Go beyond sorrow and attain everlasting fulfillment. Fulfillment of all desires. Not that all your Christmas list will be immediately, you put a tick mark and you get everything that you wanted for Christmas. Not like that. Rather, whatever we want by desiring this and that in this world, throughout our lives, we keep on seeking this and that. And whatever we want, we try to get it. And we are disappointed. We keep seeking when we are unhappy. And we go thus from lifetime to lifetime, from disappointment to disappointment, as Professor Goldstein was saying. So how do you overcome this problem? You overcome it by realizing that you are not this little body mind, that you are this infinite being, limitless freedom, limitless awareness, existence, bliss. And by that, all desiring for little things in the world ceases. You are completely fulfilled. You are, for the first time, set free from this struggle of limited existence. Although you continue to exist in this body and mind, this still continues. So that's the whole story. There is this limitless existence, awareness. That's called Brahman, infinity, just infinite reality. Then second, you realize this. You have to find this out. Notice, it is said you have to know this. The whole process is a process of knowledge. And then we will see what kind of knowledge it is. Again, we'll see an echo of what Professor Goldstein was saying. It's not a conceptual kind of knowledge. Though, referring back to what Longchenpa said, it's dry teachings and abstract philosophies without internal awakening. Dry teachings and abstract philosophies cannot give you the fruit of enlightened life, something like that, he said. I agree entirely. But dry teachings and abstract philosophies can actually lead you to that internal inner awakening, which will lead to the fruit of enlightened life. Yeah. So Longchenpa is, when I listen to Longchenpa, there is a wonderful YouTube site where a Buddhist nun has recorded the teachings of Longchenpa, translations, and reads it out in a very calm and quiet voice. It's wonderful just to listen to Longchenpa. It is, I don't know, it's so uplifting. It's just like a person who's fully enlightened and talking about it in so many different ways, the same truth. All right. Now, in the next few minutes, how do we realize it? I'll focus on the second of these three questions. The second question was, you realize it by knowing Brahman. How do you realize it? How do you know Brahman? You know it, the language was, in the sacred space of the cave of your heart. Shankara said you have to know it as yourself. I am that. But how do you do that? What will happen in the next few sections of the Taittiriya Upanishad, I'm going to summarize. And the technique, the unique technique of Advaita Vedanta. And here I want to make a point which is not usually understood. There are different techniques or different broad ways in religion, in spiritual life. One, what I might call the way of faith, which is most commonly associated with religion. There's God, heaven, and you believe in that because the scriptures say so, your spiritual tradition says so. Have faith in God, faith in your teachers, worship and surrender. And by this path of worship and devotion, you will attain, by the grace of God, you will attain to whatever goal you are going towards. So that's what's called the way of faith. In Sanskrit, a bhakti, a path of bhakti, which is pretty common in most dualistic, theistic traditions. It's something that we are familiar with. When you talk about religion, you mostly mean that. There is another path, which is the path of direct spiritual experience, a yogic path, which is very predominant in Buddhism, all strands of Buddhism. and predominant in, say, for example, Patanjali yoga in Hindu traditions, multiple in Hindu traditions. These are paths which seek extraordinary experience, mystic experience through meditation, and you get these extraordinary experiences which will show you, demonstrate to you in a sort of empirical way, quote unquote empirical way, the truth of the claims of religion. This is the yogic path, as against the bhakti path and the yogic path, the path of faith and the path of mystical experience. The path of Advaita Vedanta is a philosophical inquiry into our lived experience, not extraordinary experience, not mystical experience, not faith. There's a huge problem with faith, and there's also a huge problem with mystical experience in our modern perspective. But what has not been recognized often, I think, enough, is the great promise of Advaita Vedanta, which says you need just the quotidian experience of life, the day-to-day experience, what you already have, not extraordinary samadhis, which are acquired with superhuman effort. If you read the lives of some of the yogis, Tibetan practitioners, extraordinary effort over decades of practice, and then it gives you that kind of experience. But not even that, just the experience of waking, dreaming, sleeping, just the experience of being this person, this body mind, that's enough. Not enough to be awakened, but that's enough to start with. And then what Advaita Vedanta does is it will take you on a step-by-step journey of inquiry into this lived experience. And then you will see for yourself that you are Brahman. You are indeed not this body mind. You are limitless existence, limitless awareness. And that solves the problem. Can we do that now in the next 5 minutes? Let's give it a try. We'll give it a fair try. I'm going to speak about the practice itself, and you can track it in your own experience. So you are Brahman, and we scratch our heads and say, might be, that sounds cool, but I don't feel it. I don't think so. So the Upanishad says, and I'm actually telling you what the Upanishad will say in the next few paragraphs. Upanishad says, so what do you think you are? Point to yourself. You say, here, this is me. This is solidly, it feels real to me. I am this. So this body, we might say, I guess it's a good place to start as any. So you are this body. Yes, I think so. All right, the Upanishad says, consider this body. Look at this body. It is made of food. It is transformed from what you eat and drink, is transformed into the flesh and bones and blood of this body. And it is continuously changing. It is impermanent. And yet you feel you are the same person who was in the baby body and in the kid's body, in the middle-aged body, in the old person's body. Such dramatic changes, and yet you have a sense of continuity. So you cannot just be this body. The body is so different each time. These arguments, by the way, are not mathematical proofs. They're more like lawyers' arguments, persuasive. Another argument would be, well, impermanence is one thing, impermanence of the body and a kind of intuition of one's own permanence. But another argument would be, the body is an object. You are aware of the body. The body is not aware of you. Just as I'm aware of this pen, just as I'm aware, so I'm aware of this piece of cloth, so I'm aware of this skin. You might say, no, but the pen, you hit the pen, it doesn't hurt. If you hit your skin, it hurts. Well, I'm aware of the hurt also. That's also an object. So the body is an object, and you are that which is aware of the object. How can you be an object? It's a thing. Are you a thing? I don't think so. Then not only that, the body is not sentient by itself. You are sentient. You are aware. The body is not aware. So 3 arguments: changing and unchanging. It's an object. You are the experiencer of that object, the subject. And it is not sentient. You are sentient. Sentient and insentient. Object and subject. Changing and unchanging. They cannot be the same thing. Hence, you cannot be the body. All right, I'm not the body, but I'm something here, right? All right, let's go deeper. Notice, what else do you notice? Let me say I notice the breath. I notice sensations in my tummy. I notice the warmth, or the cold, the pain or the pleasure in this body. sensations, sensory activities, all of this, breath, something living going on in this body. And the Upanishad says, right, that's what you call prana. These are the multiple manifestations of prana. And yet, this is also changing all the time. The breath comes in and goes out. Sometimes you are hungry and thirsty. Sometimes you are satiated after food. Sometimes you're energetic. Sometimes you feel weak. Sometimes you're healthy. Sometimes you feel sick. All of these, the ebb and flow of prana in the body, the vitality, the physiological forces changing. And yet you're the same person who felt sick. Now you feel healthy. Same person who felt hungry. Now you feel satiated. You are the same. Prana keeps on changing. Not only that, you are aware of prana. I mean, the whole of Buddhist mindfulness depends on you being aware of the breath. I mean, you use the breath as an anchor. If you're aware of the breath, you can't be the breath. That's what Advaita will say. You are not literally the breath. You are that which is aware of the breath. Not only that, third, prana is not sentient. You are sentient. You are aware of prana. Prana is not aware of you. Changing, unchanging, subject, object, conscious, not conscious. You cannot be the prana, the physiological life forces in the body. But I still feel I'm here somewhere. Look deeper, says the Upanishad. You know what we are doing? We are going into this body which is described as a cave. We have passed through the outer walls of the cave, the physical body. We have passed through the middle part of the cave, which is the physiological body, the pranic body. Now we are going deeper. If you look inside, actually try it. It's right now, it's right here. The body, I am not that. Changing, unchanging, conscious, not conscious, subject, object, I am not the body. And breathe in and breathe out. Consider what you did just now. That breathing in and out, that pranic activity, I am not that. It's an object. It's something that I experienced. It's there, but I am not it. I am that which experienced it. Then go deeper. What do you find more subtle than the body, than the prana? You're entering deeper into the cave of yourself. You find mind, thoughts, emotions, memories. So this mind, this is what most people, grown-up people, identify themselves with. If you're a thinking, educated, sensitive person, mostly you think what you think of yourself is a mind, an embodied mind to be sure. But we think of ourselves as a mind. But Vedanta says is relentless. Apply the same arguments. Does the mind change, by the way? Oh boy, does it change? The mind changes all the time, endlessly. And yet you are the one who experiences the changing mind. The mind is happy, you are the one who felt happy. When the mind is sad, you are the one who felt sad. So you're the same one. Which one are you? Are you the happy mind or the sad mind? Because they cannot be the same thing. They changed. But you are the same one. Changing and unchanging. You cannot be the mind. Subject and object. Normally we think the mind is the subject and the world is the object. But now the mind itself becomes the object. And you are the experiencer of the mind. You are the witness of the mind. Therefore, you cannot be the mind. And even more stunning, conscious, not conscious. You are aware of the mind. The mind is not aware of. You can just try it. Think XYZ. I was aware of XYZ. Was XYZ aware of me? No, it's just like mental talk. It wasn't aware of me or anything else or even itself. I am the one, whatever I am that which is aware of that XYZ in the mind. So, and this, by the way, is a very interesting point of distinction. When we talk about consciousness in Vedanta, often the Vijnana Skandha in Buddhism is translated as consciousness. And so that's also not the self. So here we are excluding the mind, which might be classified with the Vijnana Skandha in Buddhism. Now, go further. You're not even the mind. The Upanishad says, are you the intellect, the one which is doing this discussion? And the same arguments apply. I'm not even the intellect, the one which is trying to understand all this. Changing, unchanging, subject, object, conscious, not conscious. And it pushes further. If you try it, actually, you will see very soon, if you drop everything that you experience, you will end up with a blank. Even for a moment, you'll end up with a quietness, a blankness. The Upanishad says that's also an object. That's also something that you're experiencing. You drop that too. And then what's there? There's no more object left there. There is that to which all of these objects are appearing and disappearing. That is what is called pure consciousness. This is the point where I tell the story of the 10th man, but I have repeated it ad nauseum. It's there online if you want to hear it. It's a wonderful story. At this point, if it's told, it's conducive to awakening. So I am, according to the Upanishad, by the way, keeps quiet. It promises to reveal you, and you get the feeling of opening like Russian nesting dolls, and trying to, you're expecting the Atman or Brahman to pop out at any moment. Nothing happens. And the Upanishad also mischievously and humorously keeps quiet. And you think, and in the Upanishad, the student asks the teacher, so the Atman doesn't exist? And the teacher said, if the Atman did not exist, and the Brahman does not exist, then you don't exist because you are Brahman. And yet you do exist. See, what has been done is, Upanishad is pushing us to tell me, show me, you exist, right? Yeah, I exist. Show me, what are you? Show yourself what you are. And every candidate that we put forward, this body, this prana, these sensory activities, this mind and memory and personality and intellect, all of them, the Upanishad shows that can't be you. It can't be. You are something other than all of this. And then finally, the Upanishad leaves it open. I mean, in Advaita Vedanta textbooks, we'll say you're pure consciousness and stuff like that. But the Upanishad is a very good teacher. It doesn't say what you are. If it tries to say, it becomes another concept. It wants you to grasp it for yourself. When you do grasp it for yourself, you know it without any doubt. It's like looking directly at the sun. Don't look directly at the sun, but it's so blazingly obvious and yet hidden. Swami Vivekananda called it the open secret. It's continuously available to us. As Professor Goldstein said, it's an uncreated freedom. It applies beautifully to this idea of limitless awareness existence. Remember, this existence is not an existing thing. This awareness is not an experience of a particular kind of conscious experience. It is that existence which makes all existing things possible. It is that awareness which powers our experiences of seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, thinking, remembering, loving, hating. All of it is pervaded by this one pure subject, pure consciousness. And then Advaita Vedanta goes on, I just add this and finish, goes on to show that all that we separated pure consciousness from, objects of the world, the body, mind, they are actually not separate from this pure consciousness. They are all appearances in this pure consciousness, a play of this pure consciousness, you will, and each of them can be used as a doorway to the realization of this pure consciousness. Because this pure consciousness, this Brahman, is present in every experience of our lives. In fact, one of the Upanishads, not this one, Kena Upanishad, says that Pratibodha Viditam Matam. You can realize this, that you are Brahman in every experience of life. In whatever you see, hear, smell, taste, touch, not in the things that you see, hear, smell, or taste, or touch. In the experiences of seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, this is being continuously revealed. Once you know it, anywhere, at any time, you know it everywhere, all the time, and you know it effortlessly. All effort is to remove the obstacles to this knowing, realizing, intuitive realization, whatever you call it. Good, I'm done. Again, I went over time, I think. Yeah.
Thank you, Swami Sarvapinaji, for this beautiful presentation of Vedanta practices. What I'd like to do now, in this remaining time, is I'd like to sort of instigate a discussion between Dr. Goldstein and Swami Sarvapinaji. And maybe I'd like to open it up by Dr. Goldstein. You just heard Swami Sarvapinaji. Maybe any thoughts, any reflections on what he said? Or do you find anything common in the Buddhist tradition? And any questions also you may want to pose to him?
So first of all, thank you, Swami. I loved what you said, and found it enlightening and enjoyable. So a few questions. based on what you said. So it may be that some people listening had a taste of the experience, understanding, whatever word we want to put to it, that you were pointing us toward. And so let's just posit that's the case, that some of us listening had this, boom, wow. But then is it not the case? Is it or is it not the case in understandings of Vedanta that if I were to have that type of opening insight, if it were not thorough enough, if it weren't deep enough, I could still find myself back in ordinary habit patterns. And that opening would then just become a memory held by the conceptual mind, right? And if maybe I hadn't trained, let's just say, maybe I hadn't trained a lot beforehand. So I was just full of ordinary habits, kind of a jerky person, okay? Could I not just go back to being that same jerky person who had this experience of opening, but if it's not thorough enough, now it's a mere memory. So if that's not the case, why is it not the case? Is it, if I have a glimpse, is it always total all at once? Everything's uprooted, there's no going back? Or if it can be partial and habit patterns and misunderstandings can reassert themselves, then what is the prescription? What are the steps? Continued type of analysis in the way you led us through? Are there other practices that might be advised to clear away the recurrent obstructing patterns arising? So I'll let you take it.
Right.
Do you understand? Do you understand the question?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay.
And this is a question that comes up, especially from serious practitioners. Inevitably, this question will come up when you come to Advaita Vedanta. And the answer to your question would be yes and no. First, the yes, a very strong affirmative yes. And the yes is the most important part of it. That one may, by listening to Advaita teachings, if you dwell on it long enough, a lot of people will just get it, what is being said. There is a period when one doesn't get it. It sounds nice, it sounds cool, but one doesn't get it really. It sounds like I've got a philosophy ready, but I don't feel like I am that reality. And then it comes upon the sudden dawning that, oh, this is what is meant, and I am that. And yet after that, it doesn't seem to have made much of a difference to my life. I mean, I seem to be just the same old person again. And note what was promised, that all desires will be fulfilled and you reach this endless fulfillment, you overcome sorrow, suffering, and it's done. That doesn't seem to be happening at all. So what's wrong there? What's gone wrong? And there is exactly what the professor just said is, it is just that all the old tradition, the inertia of past habits, which have not been cleared up, which have not been purified enough, they come and sort of sweep over this realization and seem to cover it. And one goes on behaving and reacting to the world just as the old person did before that breakthrough, before that enlightenment. And this in Advaita Vedanta would not be regarded as enlightenment. In Advaita Vedanta, they make a distinction between enlightenment and truly free while living. So the two Sanskrit words would be Tattvajnana and Jivan Mukti. So they have analyzed this. There's a whole book about this. It's called Jivan Mukti Viveka, discernment of the truly free while living. And there they say 3 factors are involved in becoming fully free while living, and what the highest state that the Advaitin aspires to, the highest realization. The 3 factors are, one factor is this enlightenment, which we talked about. This is what we were talking about till now. Only one factor. The other 2 factors are is the purification of the mind, which is called vasanakshaya, the destruction of the underlying desire patterns. And then manonasha, which is scarily translated as destruction of the mind, which is basically just the ability to focus and plunge the mind into samadhi. Now, if those two factors are not attained, you have an intuitive breakthrough, then there's a discussion. What happens to such a person? Such a person will undergo exactly what you said, repeated patterns of past behavior and the feeling of being swept away from the enlightenment, the understanding that one attained, and so on. So what's the prescription? The prescription is, if you have had that enlightenment, that moment of aha, moment of breakthrough, good for you. Congratulations. Back to practice now. And what do you practice? More of the same thing that you are hopefully have been doing all along. Regular meditation, a strictly ethical life, maybe your traditional Hindu devotional practices. All of those help to purify the mind and focus the mind. So basically two preconditions: purification of mind, focused mind. If we have done our sadhana long enough, thoroughly enough, before the moment of breakthrough, there's a term for that, kritopasti, one who has completed the course of sadhana. That person will not require any further practice. The moment of breakthrough is the moment of total enlightenment, and it will continue afterwards. The other one is called akritopasti, those who have not satisfactorily completed the entire process of sadhana. They can still have an enlightenment experience. But instead of going out on a book tour or giving on a lecture tour or something, it's strongly recommended that you plunge back into sadhana, into intense spiritual practices, and complete the process. So this is the yes part of it. There's a no part of it also, what you said. And the no part of it is, I just touch upon it and leave it there. Is it necessary? The teacher at that point, if somebody complains, I had this breakthrough, but now I seem to be back to where I was, and it's not seeming to be very effective. The teacher will try something at this point and see if it works. The teacher will say, so you are Brahman, you realize that, and now you feel you're back to that old person. What is back to that old person? Is Brahman back to that old person? Was that old person also Brahman? You must now realize that Brahman, you were Brahman all throughout. If something has gone back to that old person and is having problems, is it you or the mind? And so this kind of probing, if it throws the person back into the state of realization, it will work. But sometimes it doesn't. So sadhana, spiritual practice, unavoidable.
Thank you, Swami Sarvapri and Dr. Goldstein. Swamiji, is there any question you'd like to ask Dr. Goldstein, or any insights that came up in his discussion on practices in Buddhism?
Yes, so many questions, but I'll go back to the favorite, which everybody keeps asking when you talk about Vedanta and Buddhism, is the old question of self and not self. It's a worthwhile question to ask. Thinking, I mean, if you look back upon Hindu schools and Buddhist schools debating it for nearly a millennium, I think, in India. So what is your take on this? A worthwhile philosophical discussion, or by the fact that we know, once we know both of these thought systems in depth, we begin to see that, no, it's more of a terminological problem, more of a conceptual problem. And in ultimate terms, they seem to be pointing towards the same thing.
So for the tradition that I'm situated in, it really seems to be more of a terminological problem, a conceptual problem. And then there are other considerations along with that I can gesture to briefly in a moment, but that provided that we understand the type of consciousness you're talking about in a certain way, then maybe it would be a terminological problem. Because from the Mahayana Buddhist side, so I'm not just speaking about, say, Nyingma tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, but really Mahayana Buddhism as it comes to be developed in India, say from the 4th, 5th century, certainly 7th, 8th century CE onward. The majority of the traditions kind of take the line that I'm about to take, which is that there's the consciousness that we're interested in, so to speak, is what they call svasamvitti, svasamvedana. It's a consciousness that is intrinsically always already imbued with knowing, imbued with awareness. But that the sense of you spoke about this, the sense of a subject is an overlay, a conceptual overlay being created on top of that consciousness, what we might call pure consciousness or intrinsic awareness. I like to use the term intrinsic knowingness, that there's a natural knowingness, and we don't have to speak about a somebody who's the knower, knowing something. So if when you're speaking of pure consciousness, if you're not speaking about a subjectivity in the sense of a subject, but you're speaking about a knowing that's really beyond the bounds of a witnessing, knowing subject, knowing something, if that's cleared away as a construction that's been seen through, that the true nature of our being is not that, because that can be seen by knowing, right? So therefore it is a type of object, this sort of subject-object overlay. If that's the case, then I think in Mahayana, we're talking about a terminological distinction with Vedanta, that they're really pointing to the same thing. But there's other considerations. You already mentioned differences matter, because the way that we articulate the path, different ways of articulating the path with different terms, some of those ways speak to some sorts of people and other ways speaks to other sorts of people. So it's not irrelevant. It doesn't always have to be a matter of one is better or one is worse, but different ways, a Vedanta way of speaking and a Mahayana Buddhist way of speaking may just resonate with different sorts of people. So they have their different uses. That's one possibility. But then parts of the conceptual systems are different too, and those differences may be important in everyday life. So even if the ultimate realization is the same, the way that the path is articulated has similarities, but also differences. So we don't just want to say it's all the same. Maybe at an ultimate level, what's being pointed to is the same, but then on the ordinary level, how this plays out could be a little bit different. And then now speaking more as a historical academic scholar, it seems to me some of these positionings has to do a lot with kind of cultural social identity, that from an early stage, the Buddhists decided early on in India, we're not part of the Vedic tradition, and they really wanted to differentiate themselves from Vedic tradition, say we're something else than that in terms of social life, intellectual life, and likewise, followers of the whole Vedic tradition that you began to outline certainly didn't want to say that we're Gnostikas who just deny all the Vedas. So there's a lot of like maintaining social identities by saying we're so different from each other. And I don't know that nowadays we're obligated to buy into all of that. May have mattered to people long ago, but it doesn't have to matter in the same way to us. We can just perhaps take note of it. So did that answer your question, or did it just puzzle you more?
No, that's really helpful. I think that's really helpful. The way I sometimes put it is, it's useful to learn both also. I have personally found it useful. You don't have to learn both, but I found it useful because it seems to be balancing and equipoising each other. The problem with the Advaitic approach can be, the Vedantic approach, Advaitic approach can be that you end up thinking of Brahman or Atman as a thing. There's some reality, some thing called Brahman. And the problem with the Madhyamaka path especially could be nihilism. There are constant pointers to, it seems, towards nothing. Even the terminology is like nothing. And the way I try to put it is, it's not a thing, it's not nothing either, it's no thing. Yeah, so no hyphen thing. That is, I think, that's one of the advantages of learning both. Just one more question, Swami, do we have time for? Yeah, I'd like to give the same question to Professor Goldstein, which he posed to me, because my study of Tsongkhapa under Professor Garfield and some of the later masters, Mifam, for example, I forgot the name. They had a time when they brought the systems together, a couple of 200-300.
The Rime or non.
The Rime tradition, yes. And Longchenpa earlier, and now say Tulku Urgen Rinpoche. What I find is, what the answer to your question, there is a lot of sophisticated reasoning and practice in Tibetan traditions about that, persons who feel they have got an insight and would like to stabilize. So would you speak to that? If a person comes, I get it, but it's still not effective in my life. I feel I can't hold on to it, and I feel I'm not getting the benefit from it which I should. Then what would a Nyingma tradition or other traditions, how would they pitch in? How would they advise such a person?
Sure. Yes, happily. So first I'll say, in the Nyingma tradition, to use it as an example, there are 9 different approaches that are set up in a hierarchy, where the 9th is the highest, it's the subtlest. And the highest of these 9 spiritual approaches is very, very similar to the type of exercise and outlook that you walked us through. It's called Ati Yoga, or highest yoga, but it's not a yoga. It's not a practice. There's no need for concentration per se or special meditative experience. It's really about the view. It's really about having a lived understanding of a view of what's already been the case. And so just to say that that's there, and so therefore the problem that you bring up is all the more pressing for these Buddhists, because there are people who go through an exploration and exercise similar to what you just did, and you're well aware there are other kinds of exercises that could be brought in to divest us of the attachments that we are enmeshed. We think I'm this, and we start to let go of all of that. And then we have some opening to the deeper self or deeper being. So so this is a common problem recognized by Mahayana Buddhism, and there's a few things to say about it. First of all, they're very careful about the term awakening. So sometimes in English, we're calling the term, a Buddha just means awakened, literally, right? And what a Buddha has realized is Bodhi, awakening. A Buddha is an awakened being who has realized awakening. In English, we're calling that enlightenment a lot. So fine, no problem. We can call it enlightenment too. But Mahayana Buddhism never uses the term enlightenment, if they're being careful, unless someone is fully realized, which means there are none of the obscurations covering this realization left at all. There's none of the patterning that you were just speaking about that's left to be removed. Only then do they talk about full awakening or full enlightenment. So they'll say it's very possible and not too uncommon for someone to have a direct taste, a direct glimpse. So they'll call it a realization, is usually the term that they'll use. In Sanskrit, abhisamaya is one of the terms used. To have a direct glimpse of the unconditioned, of this vast nature that's beyond anything in time and space, any particular appearance. But then all these habit patterns are still left. Some of the negativities, the kleshas, are left in mind, especially the deeper roots of the active misknowing that's misconstruing experience. That's left, and so that can give rise to these other negativities. And then the habit patterns may have lost some of their force, depending on how deeply the glimpse into the unconditioned is, but some of the habit patterns are usually there. So then the way the path is laid out is very similar to what you said, Swami. The prescription is more practice and the continued practice. So starting with an ethical foundation and practices of love and compassion, which in the tradition that I'm talking about here, actively producing love and compassion. It's very common to do a contemplation that will give rise to and expand a feeling of love to a particular person or to everyone or all beings at large. But it's understood that that too is actually just clearing away what's standing in the way of a boundless love, an uncreated love that's already there. So the effortful love may be creating a connection with the boundless, uncreated love that's shining forth all the time in us, but is like a sun covered by the clouds of our obscuration. So all sorts of practices, the practices of love and compassion, practices of concentration, practices of insight and analysis to clear away holding on to different standpoints and holding on to essences, holding on to anything. These would all be practiced, but also many practices related to the body, certain sorts of bodily type energy yogas, freeing blockages and knots within the energy centers, the chakras, freeing the flow and the communication among the chakras in different ways, the head center and throat and heart and navel center. All of these things can be understood to remove the patterning, because the last thing I'll say, I could go on and on, but I'll stop in a sec. And the last thing I'll mention is, from the Mahayana perspective, one way to understand what we are in an ordinary sense is we have an embodiment, we're a body in a certain sense, and we have energy, prana you were speaking about, breath and energy, and then we have mind. And on an ordinary sense, there's a continuum from kind of formlessness to more substantial form, right? As we go from mind to energy to body, that body is a little bit more in the form area. But the point that I want to get across is there are methods to, they're all interconnected, body, energy, and mind. And so working sufficiently with energy can transform any blockages within the body and mind. Working sufficiently through the mind can transform, working with any one of them can transform all of them. Working with all three skillfully in conjunction can really supercharge the process of clearing away obscurations. So in the Nyingma tradition, there's less focus on shunyata as a nothingness, and there's much more focus on what they talk about as the ever-present sphere of awakening, or what we, in English, we would translate it Buddha nature. So much so that other traditions would like to criticize them. Other Buddhists would like to criticize them and say, kind of what Buddhists would sometimes say about Brahman, right? Other Buddhists will criticize the Nyingma tradition and say, you're making this into a thing, and so they try to walk that balance.
Yes, reifying it. I think that's the two poles. You constantly see that in the Geluk debates, that you're swinging between the two poles of nihilism and reification into something real, so eternalism. And the way to defeat your opponent is to push or accuse them of one of these two problems and then try to push them into that corner. Yeah, right. That's very helpful. There's a vast, the one thing is, one must point out, as an Advaitin, I'm pointing out the wonderful work that scholars like Professor Goldstein and Garfield and others have done over a few decades. There's such a vast range of beautifully translated and produced books of all these traditions and texts. That's an enormous service, and this is something that we must do more in Advaita Vedanta traditions, I think.
Just comment on that quickly. When I was a freshman in college, then I was doing yoga, hatha yoga, for sports injury, and then I was having very unexpected, unpremeditated, certain sorts of openings appearing, and I was trying to make sense of what was going on. And I walked into the library to find some books on yoga to try to figure out something very positive and unusual is happening, but I have no idea what this is, have no way to place this. And the first book that I came to that I distinctly remember was an English translation of Shankara's Viveka Chudamani. And reading that totally set me on my whole path for life. So it wasn't a Buddhist text that got me going into a career of studying this and being here talking to you. It was a text by Shankara, who, as you said, is maybe the key figure within the Advaita tradition. So it's just nice to remember that.
Yeah.
Thank you, both of you. So at this point, we'll have about 15 more minutes. I want to open it up to Q&A. So if you'd like to ask a question, there's an electronic hand. Go to the reactions down at the bottom of your screen, click on reactions, and your hand will pop up, and we can call on you then. Okay, so go to reactions and click on that if you'd like to ask a question. In the meantime, I'd like to ask to both of you, traditionally, how has Buddhism influenced Vedanta and vice versa? Do we like maybe when we hear about Gaudapada, Shankara's Guru Gaudapada and his dialogue in Buddhism, did he take some parts of Buddhism, maybe the two-tier theory? Are there aspects within Buddhism that have found their way in Vedantic teachings? And also, similarly, are there aspects of Vedanta that's found its way in Buddhist teachings? Anybody?
Oh,
Swami, go ahead.
I hope you know how politically and theologically and philosophically loaded that question is. One could go on and on and on, and people have written all sorts of emotionally charged, articles and essays, for and against this position.
I see.
But as an Advaitin,
Yes.
I would freely admit that a good deal of Buddhist, I would say at the minimum, Buddhist logic, Buddhist insights into into the nature of ultimate reality, they have been incorporated into making sense of a non-dualism already present in the Upanishads. I'll explain what I mean by this. I had an insight into this when I found an ancient text by Bhava Viveka, one of the early Madhyamaka philosophers, just after Nagarjuna. So where he refutes all other systems of thought, that means opponents of Madhyamaka Buddhism, including the prevalent Hindu systems at that time. And Vedanta gets a short chapter, gets the short shrift in a short chapter. And there, the Vedanta, his view of this early Buddhist philosopher, about 1500 years ago, his view is, it's an illogical system. It doesn't seem to make any sense. It's inconsistent. And so it doesn't deserve much attention. It shows its inconsistencies sweepingly and then goes ahead. But what is he quoting there? He's quoting from the Purusha Suktam. He's quoting from the original Vedic texts. And he's right. One eternal, unchanging spiritual reality pervading all of this. So he says all of this is continuously changing. How can, if it's exactly the same as all of this, how can it be unchanging? If it is different from all of this, then it cannot be non-dual. You're talking about something else then. It doesn't make sense. And then he goes ahead. And exactly the same texts, something happens in the next 500 years or so, where Gaudapada comes in, Shankara comes in, and now there are very good answers for all of these questions. And what are those answers? Look, there are two levels of reality. There's an absolute level of reality, and there's an appearance level of reality. And using the words, almost the same words used by Nagarjuna 800 years ago, even long before Shankara, Paramarthika Satyam. Nagarjuna says the Buddha taught two levels of truth, Paramarthika and Samritti. And so that becomes the Paramarthika and Vyavaharika of Shankara, of Gaudapada. And the thing is that I can see people from my camp would be furious at this response and this, it's all there in the Upanishads. Yes, it's there, but it's implicitly there. It needed the heavy lifting done by this logical machinery developed with centuries. Yes, and the Buddhists developed it because they had to face equal criticism from their non-Buddhist opponents, which were the Vedic schools and the Jaina schools. So it's a mutual give and take. And the beauty of the give and take at that time was you will find the DNA of both systems in each other's systems. In the final developments, which I take to be the Madhyamaka Yogachara on the Buddhist side about 1,000 years ago in India, which I learned from Professor Garfield, how much further it was taken in Tibet by the Tibetan philosophers there, Tsongkhapa and others. And on the Hindu side, I would take it to be Advaita Vedanta, maybe some varieties of Kashmiri Shaivism, as the professor said, and then further developed in a varieties of Hindu systems which came up, the various schools of Vedanta later on. So these two systems, if you look, they seem very, that's the reason for the uncanny similarity. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much. Dr. Goldstein, any comments on this?
Sure. There are many directions to take, as Swami said. So I'm just going to pick one particular angle, which is that when Mahayana Buddhism starts to come to the forefront of the historical record, which is like in the final centuries BCE and early centuries CE, then it appears when writing appears, when apparently Mahayanists now have the ability to write texts, and they can get their texts out because writing becomes widespread in India. So that's when we start to see Mahayana Buddhism. And a number of the earliest texts of Mahayana Buddhism, they're a class of texts. It's a bit of a mouthful in Sanskrit. It's called the Prajnaparamita Sutras, the scriptures that deal with the transcendent activity of insight, that deal with a transcendent understanding. And these scriptures continually point in the direction, these are Buddhist scriptures, they point in the direction of an all-at-once sort of realization, that there's a condition of freedom that is possible to realize, and that it's possible to realize it all at once, and it doesn't have to come about through concentration or special yogic methods, as Swami was explaining to us previously. And I'm just reading behind the text as a scholar and historian, and I feel that there's a great deal of indebtedness to the Upanishads here. That the Upanishads, many centuries previously, are putting forth not the possibility and the desirability of a direct all-at-once realization that doesn't necessarily require all this special yogic training, just as Swami told us. And so these scriptures are pointing toward the same thing. And then the project for Mahayana Buddhism, one way to see it in the centuries that follow, is to clearly articulate a path that can acknowledge, yes, an all-at-once sort of realization is both possible and desirable, and yet, how do we minimize the problem that Swami and I were discussing earlier, that we can have an actual, genuine, non-conceptual, we say unmediated by concepts, taste of that realization of an unconditioned freedom and an unconditioned mode of being, and we may still fall into problems, right? So then the Mahayana is going to create a synthesis of how to train, that ideally it's better to develop all these positive qualities first, develop strong stability of attention, because then when attention can just rest and let go and find itself in this ultimate sphere, it's stable already. So it doesn't just revert back to the misunderstandings that Swami and I were talking about, that now again, I feel myself to be a small self. I had a glimpse, but now it's lost. If attention is well trained, and it can just remain stable there more easily. And so this becomes part of the project of Mahayana Buddhism, is to articulate a path where a sudden all at once realization, similar to the Upanishads, can be stabilized due to previous practices of the path. So I would say that is probably largely indebted to the interaction and the understandings that Buddhists are having with the Vedantins around them.
Thank you, Dr. Goldstein, so much. Beautiful. I'd like to take just a few questions. I know time's getting late, so Subir, you're going to be, when I call on you, please just state your name, where you're residing right now, and just get to the question, and so that they can answer the question and we can go along. So Sagangu. Okay.
No, that's my ID. My name is Shayantan Ganguly,
Mhm.
and I'm in Detroit right now. So I'll start with my regards to both Swamiji and Dr. Goldstein. It has been a beautiful session. Um, I'll come to my question. So basically, what I wanted to ask is, I've heard something about the Dalai Lama taking the aspirants into some sort of a guided session where under his instructions, the purpose is to, to get the breakthrough. Following his instructions, they can probably get a breakthrough. I Can one of you speak a little more about this if you are aware, if you know about it? One of you or both of you?
Professor Goldstein.
I'll speak about it briefly. So there is a tradition within Buddhism that starts in India, certainly during tantric times, say so by like the 8th, 9th, 10th century CE, where there are all kinds of stories and texts about a teacher directly pointing out the ultimate nature to a student. And we call these upadesha, or we sometimes say pointing out instruction, directly pointing to the ultimate nature of being, of phenomena. And then this gets transmitted into Tibet. But this already exists in the Upanishads in a certain sense, and it's already refined, and Swami can tell us more, throughout Advaita Vedanta, well before the centuries that I'm talking about. So they're already pointing out instructions, pointing directly to the ultimate nature in Hindu traditions. But in the Nyingma tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, this is very, very important. And this is part of the higher teachings that I didn't really speak so much about. But the other teachings prepare one so that when the true nature is pointed out skillfully by a teacher, we can get it, right? It's like, so that we can get what Swami walked us through earlier. So yes, this exists. It exists in India, it exists in Tibet, but I think that the Hindu traditions had the lead on the Buddhists when it comes to the pointing out historically. So I don't know if you want to say more about that.
Swami.
Exactly what he said, that.
Okay.
That's the pointing out.
Thank you. Raka, where are you coming from?
Hello, I'm coming from Seattle. Thank you so much to Swamiji. Wonderful to see you. Sorry I missed you in DC a few weeks ago. And thank you, Professor Goldstein. I was struck by the question and Swamiji, your response to basically the Jivan Mukta, how can we make this thing real in our lives? You spoke about three things: seeing the reality, purification of mind, and then destruction of the mind. And it seemed to me that's like a direct corollary to the threefold training of Sila, Samadhi, and Prajna that we talk about in Buddhism, which is the Eightfold Path. So I was just wondering, is there a corollary like that in Hinduism? Is there something like Sila, Samadhi, and Prajna in Advaita Vedanta?
Absolutely. In fact, these terms which I just used, Tattva Jnana, Vasanakshaya, Manonasha, these are terms from Yoga Vasishta. Later on, they were incorporated into this text called Jivan Mukti Viveka. I can show you the text also. There's a beautiful translation by Swami Mokshadanandaji from our tradition, published by Advaita Ashram, Jivan Mukti Viveka. So these are old terms, but they're just fancy ways of renaming the basic practices. So there are basic practices in Advaita Vedanta which you have to undergo to just qualify to be a Vedanta student are Chitta Shuddhi and Chitta Ekagrata, purification of the mind and focus of the mind, stability of the mind. And purification of the mind comes through Karma Yoga, and stability of the mind comes through Dhyana Yoga, or just yoga, the meditation, yoga of meditation. Taken to their climax, taken to their peak, they would be Vasanakshaya and Manonasha. Manonasha, again, it sounds terrible, the destruction of the mind. It's not literally destruction of the mind. It's complete focus and the ability to enter into Samadhi. It's not just calmness of mind, it's not just meditativeness, it's actually the culmination of meditation, samadhi. And this is very useful for stabilizing the wisdom arising out of that enlightenment moment. Yeah.
Thank you. Prashanjit, where are you coming from?
Yeah, I'm Prasenjit Sarkar. I'm calling in from Philadelphia. Pranam Swamiji, Swarupanandaji, and thank you so much, Dr. Goldstein. Swamiji, I do have a question. This session was about practice. And first I have a question for you, Swamiji, and then if Dr. Goldstein could also expound on that. That is with Shat Sampati, the 6 virtues that we talk about during our sadhana. And there is a role of Shraddha, which is faith. And I know that you mentioned that, you know, the Tattvamasi is really just can be visible. You don't have to believe in it. But how important is the role of conviction or Shraddha in that practice? And then Dr. Goldstein, do you have something similar in Buddhism that is critical for practice?
So faith, Shraddha, is one of the requirements for a student, a Vedantic student. Now, if you ask a traditional Vedanta teacher, or if you look at the old texts, how important is Shraddha? Shraddha, faith is not quite adequate to capture Shraddha. Shraddha is very deep and very wide. It sort of shapes one's whole worldview. It gives stuffing, moral stuffing, you know, to a person's character. So Gita says, whatever your Shraddha is, that's what you are. So it's that important. So a traditional answer would be, it's really important. If Shraddha is strong, everything else becomes easier for you. Now, the why I underplay it a little bit, because in this day and age, it's immediately conflated with blind faith, believing in stuff. And then how is it different from somebody who is just, you know, believes in God because his his tradition told him, or born into a religion, believes in something. So isn't just believing. I mean, I have in my mind, Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins. What would they say to this? So the way I put it is, the Shraddha that is required of us, the faith that is required of us in Advaita Vedanta is more or less like the kind of faith required to, you know, go to class in Harvard or in Columbia University here. You don't go into class thinking that the textbooks are fake news, that the professor is lying. No, you go into it with the faith that there's some real stuff here and worthwhile, and I don't get it now. Let me listen carefully and try to understand with the hope that I'll get it. And my questions are also born out of that kind of faith, that there is something really worthwhile exploring here. That's just the opposite of, you know, being a hardcore skeptic who just goes in thinking this is all wrong. So that attitude, this is all wrong, at any moment I feel somehow I know better and I can disprove all of this. That attitude is not a spiritual attitude. It won't work. It won't take you anywhere. I don't think it's a good attitude to learn anything at all, anything deep and difficult at all. So that much faith is required, which will sustain you in your inquiry till you begin to see for yourself.
Dr. Goldstein?
Well, that was just so beautifully put. I like to soak that in. Shraddha, faith as a type of positive outlook, very much along the lines of what Swami just beautifully articulated, is important in all forms of Buddhism and in Mahayana Buddhism particularly, and is very potentially powerful, but also can go astray. And the tradition talks about this, that it can turn into a type of blind belief and on occasion into a sort of silliness, even depending on how it's directed. However, not being a teacher, just being a student who's been around a lot of Dharma in different ways, I'll tell you my observation, because Tarthang Tulku, this teacher whom I follow, he talks in certain circles about how powerful faith can be, but he knows it's not for most people in today's day and age. So I would just say this: if you have a spiritual path, like with the Ramakrishna Order and Vedanta Society, and you've checked it out, and you know it's solid and it's good and so on, and nobody's gonna do harm to anyone and all of that, once you've really like done that checking out, I would just say, as a piece of personal advice, friend to friend, if you're then able to generate deep faith, do it. You know, once you've really thoroughly checked it out, because it can really take you places, you know. And in Mahayana Buddhism, it's not only faith, but it's qualities like devotion, a deep gratitude and admiration for the teachers and the awakened beings. These are said to really be able to move us on the path. And the type of devotion and bhakti, the sort of like love that Swami was talking about, are very, very important. Even though they're dualistic, they can move us and morph into a non-dual stance. And so these are also really these sort of affective, heartfelt, devotional stances that partly go hand in faith. These are big in Mahayana Buddhism.
Thank you, Dr. Goldstein. So there are 4 hands raised. So I'll give it another 5 minutes because I know it's getting late back east. So Vidya, where are you calling from, or where are you coming from? And what's your question?
Swamiji, and thank you, Dr. Goldstein. I'm in Santa Barbara, California. And what came to my mind as you were discussing this wonderful talk tonight is having practiced both Vedanta and Tibetan Buddhism for many, many years now. What I wondered is the understanding of deity from Advaita Vedanta and from the pinnacle of the yanas that you were speaking of, Dr. Goldstein, from Ati Yoga. So in Ati Yoga, we hear that deity is empty yet appearing, empty yet causally efficacious, and we use deity practice in development and completion stage practices that are a lower yana, but they ultimately reveal this non-dualistic, transcendent realization. And Swamiji, in Advaita Vedanta, we still will hear Ramakrishna express the will of the Divine Mother. And I just would love to hear what your comment is to understand that more clearly from this non-dualistic understanding.
Swami Sarvapinaji?
Oh, okay. By the way, I just want to thank Vidya because she has recommended just some of the best books in my collection on Tibetan Buddhism. So she shares what she hears from the lamas with me. So the will of the Divine Mother from a non-dual perspective, it could go something like this. You know that there is one unlimited being awareness. That's all that there is. But it's also appearing as this display. As long as you are in this Vidya name and form, you would continue to experience this world, its sights, sounds, smells, tastes, its ups and downs, its people, its interactions, all of that like a blazing display of this one limitless being. If you still have a question about why things are happening this way rather than that way, then it's the will of the Divine Mother.
Dr. Goldstein?
So in Tantric Buddhism, in the non-dual traditions, then we understand from a higher point of view that everything that appears is already pure. It's already of the nature of nirvana. And so one way to talk about this in a tantric way is to say everything that appears is deity. And it's like a manifestation of deity. It's already sacred. It's sacred appearance. And so this applies to any and every perception, including the activity of mind, including concepts, if we relate to concepts as a manifestation of energy and not to the story that they claim to tell. Then thoughts too are not a problem. Thoughts are deity. They're a sacred manifestation of this underlying being and energy. and then, as you said, there are practices where we can identify ourselves as deity. But the other thing to say quickly is that on an ultimate level for Mahayana Buddhism, deity is uncatchable, unquantifiable, but then it manifests both in ordinary forms as teachers and other things in our regular experience that we might encounter. But it also can manifest on a subtle level. So in Mahayana Buddhism, an awakened being understands everything that we're experiencing and therefore can relate with us. But an awakened being, that consciousness has its own set of appearances, which are blissful, joyful, and its set of appearances are like a pure appearance. And sometimes we call that deity or a pure land, that for an awakened being experiences a pure land, while still being able to relate to us in our impure lands, right?
Thank you, Dr. Goldstein. Next, Seema.
Yes, I'll turn my video on. Okay.
Thank you.
You can see me.
Yes.
Pranam Swamiji and Professor Goldstein, namaste. I'm from Fayetteville, North Carolina. I just wanted to state something and that Lord Krishna began the Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita's from Satya Yug, Treta Yug, Dwapar Yug, and we are in Kali Yug. 5,000 years ago, he stated all of that again. And then 2,500 years ago was Buddha born, the 9th avatar of Vishnu. So when Buddha, the Hindu prince, all his acharyas, gurus were imported to teach him Vedanta, Upanishads, and all of that. So he grew up knowing that, and then he wanted to inquire for himself the underlying reason for dukkha. So then he developed his own philosophy, which was again based on the Vedanta. So that's why there are so many similarities when I hear that. I was a Buddhist, I was in my Buddhist group for 10 years, but that didn't seem to satisfy me because I wanted to talk about soul and God and so on. So my question is, can you clarify? Thank you. What would you say about that? Both of you, please.
I think you put it fairly well. I'm just, what you said reminds me of a gentleman in the Vedanta Society in Hollywood, when he was asked about, what is Vedanta? And the way he put it was, think of it as Buddhism with God.
Dr. Goldstein, any comment?
I think Swami's answered it well.
Okay,
Very
thank
good.
you. Thank you. Next is Nalin. Nalin, where are you?
Yeah,
Yes.
Pranam. Can you hear me? Pranam Swamiji. Namaste, Professor Goldstein. So I listened to both of you, and I understand that Kashmiri Shaivism is something that Dr. Goldstein also today just mentioned, and Swamiji also mentions it in many of his lectures. So my question is, both of you, do you practice Kashmiri Shaivism to some extent, and is there any teacher or guide who can help in US or in India to understand some deeper practices of Kashmiri Shaivism? Thank you.
I'll go first.
Yes.
Okay. Yes, I find it a fascinating system, very sophisticated, very diverse. For example, for one reason would be one question I keep facing when I talk about Advaita Vedanta is, well, that's cool, but what do we do now? And Advaita doesn't seem to have much by the way of doing. Advaitins would say, well, you just come back and listen to what I said. You haven't heard it clearly. Otherwise, this question wouldn't come. What do I do now? But on the other hand, Kashmiri Shaivism, the Pratyabhijna philosophy or the Trika philosophy of ancient Kashmir, has endless things to say about doing. endless practices prescribed there. Even the text like Vijnana Bhairava has 112 meditative practices, all designed to take you to enlightenment. So yes, I am fascinated by Kashmiri Shaivism. Am I a Kashmiri Shaiva? No. By philosophical conviction, I am an Advaita Vedantin. The reason is and I don't know if this could be misunderstood, but it's better to say it outright. It is philosophically deeply problematic. Which is one of the reasons why I think just about no other school of this entire spectrum of Indian philosophy has taken the Kashmiri Shaivas on in philosophical debate or in dialectics. Someone even as deep as Abhinavagupta, as prolific, he engages with just about every school of Indian philosophy. None of them engage with him. And I mean, as far as not in a major way. They mention Kashmiri Shaivism. If you want to know why, one example would be a modern writer, Chandradhar Sharma, in his book on the Advaita traditions in Indian philosophy. He has an appendix about what Advaita Vedanta would respond to Kashmiri Shaivism if he were, and there he is very caustic about, but only in a philosophical sense. So in a practical, from a spiritual practitioner's point of view, Kashmiri Shaivism is very powerful. The reason is this. One of the authorities whom you can look up to in USA, in Kashmiri Shaivism, Pratyabhigya philosophy, is Professor Sthaneshwar Timalsina, who's already there, right there in San Diego. He is a scholar and practitioner of Kashmiri Shaivism. So he is a good guide academically and practically also. So he said, and he agreed with this, I see Kashmiri Shaivism as an attempt to systemize the phenomenology of sadhana. So when you engage in multiple spiritual practices, you come across various experiences, spiritual experiences. Now, if you give philosophical weight to those spiritual experiences and try to design a system or systems around those multiple mystical experiences, you will get what someone called a Baroque philosophy, like Kashmiri Shaiva Darshana. Which is not to say that I'm not a practitioner. I'm not a Kashmiri Shaivite by philosophical conviction, but if I were to be honest, the kind of practices that we do in the Ramakrishna mission, the mantra practices, the deity visualization practices, the pujas that we do, all of them are impregnated with, a great deal of understanding from the Kashmiri Shaiva traditions. You can't understand the entire mantra tradition without Kashmiri Shaivism. Advaita Vedanta is almost virtually silent about most of these practices. I look at Advaita Vedanta as you take a helicopter to the peak of the mountain, but on the way, you get to the peak of the mountain, but you miss all the valleys and the scenery, you miss the scenic route. And Kashmiri Shaivism is the scenic route. It gets you there, and it gives you, as Vivekananda said, I know every inch of the way now.
Thank you, Swamiji. Dr. Goldstein, anything further?
I love that it's the scenic route. That is a great way to put it. A couple of things further is that you already got this great recommendation for someone to look up to learn more about the tradition. I would say this, that Swami already taught us previously that once there's a glimpse of the deeper nature, anything can then be a doorway to it or an expression of it. And we see this in certain aspects of Kashmiri Shaivism, but this is also very much in the Nyingma tradition. So there's a great deal of emphasis in both of those traditions on beauty and on appreciating beauty, because perception, when it's refined, our perception becomes beautiful and deeply joyful. Just looking at a tree can be so joyful and beautiful and wondrous and vivid. And that perception, a visual perception, an auditory perception, these can be doorways to the ultimate nature. They're expressive of it, And if we're not resting in it, they can lead us back to resting within it. And so an aesthetic, an artistic or aesthetic sensitivity to the senses and their beauty, including the beauty of the natural world, we find this in Kashmiri Shaivism, and it's emphasized very much in the Nyingma, and especially the teachings of the teacher that I'm connected with, Tarthang Tulku. He has many, many books about working with beauty and spending time in nature to cultivate beauty as a doorway to the deeper parts of our being. So, and Swami knows well, Abhinavagupta is a famous writer on aesthetics and aesthetic theory, which was part of my dissertation years back. So, so there are connections there.
Just one thing I want to ask Professor Goldstein. Is this okay if I?
Yes, go ahead. Yes.
So the comment I made just now in passing about not engaging with Kashmiri Shaivism, would you say that's largely true of the Tibetan Buddhist masters also? Because if you look at Abhinavagupta, if you look at Utpaladeva, they engage with Advaita, they engage with Sankhya, Nyaya, they engage with a range of Buddhist masters, especially the Yogacara and the Pramana schools, on matters of ontology, epistemology. But is this true the other way around? Do the Buddhist schools take the Kashmiri schools seriously?
Good question. So the short answer is I don't know. I will ask Parimal Patel at Harvard, because his focus is late Indian Buddhist philosophy, 9th to 11th centuries. This is what he's working on, and that only a few people can really delve in and read those texts. So I will ask him soon about that. But in Tibet, I can say on the Tibetan side, they do not speak specifically about Kashmiri Shaivism. However, historically, we can detect some cross-fertilization in practices.
Yeah.
And sometimes in terminology used to talk about practices. So yogis, you already said there's this great interest in Kashmiri Shaivism of all of these yogic practices, and yogis like that, they like to cross traditions. Bounds of traditions don't matter to them. They'll go to this teacher and that teacher. So we see evidence of that remaining in Tibetan traditions.
Thank you so much. Robert.
Thank you both very much for your teaching. My question to both of you is, we learn from Swami what the self is not. It's not this body, it's not the mind, and so on. What about the possibility that the self is an illusion? It doesn't exist. And a model for considering this question would be non-human primates. Chimpanzees have a body, they have a mind, they have consciousness. Do they also have some universal consciousness which transcends their individual consciousness?
Dr. Goldstein, would you like to begin?
Yeah, the Nyingma take on this is all beings have the fully present, fully developed Buddha nature. Chimpanzees, worms, amoebas. It's hidden. It's a hidden mind of freedom. So it's there. And at the ultimate level, we can't even differentiate, but that there's no boundaries about the consciousness we're talking about at the ultimate level, even though we can talk ordinarily that there's a chimp over here and there's Elon Goldstein over here and so on and so forth. For Buddhists, Mahayana Buddhists, the ordinary self is an ongoing construction of consciousness, moment by moment being constructed through the mind, without the solidity that it claims to possess. But there's a deeper level of being, which sometimes in Mahayana, including Tibetan Buddhism, they like to call it the self. They call it the Maha-Atman. The great self. We find that terminology in Nyingma tradition. They're kind of not shy, but then they're not talking about a small ego self.
Swami, anything you'd like to add?
Well, what Professor said, and in addition, if we look at Advaita Vedanta and modern panpsychism like David Chalmers or Tanuni's integrated information theory, where they are all talking about the possibility of ubiquitous consciousness, let alone a chimp. Even like a piece of stone would have some basal level of consciousness, which is completely anathema to a materialist perspective. But if you ask an Advaitin this question, would a chimp have some kind of universal consciousness? They would reverse it. Would universal consciousness manifest as a chimp? It would, and it does. Why a chimp? It manifests as from, in Vivekananda's words, from yonder worm to the Nazarene. He's talking to a Christian audience. From a worm to Jesus Christ, who is the highest point of evolution. So all of that is a manifestation of consciousness, of awareness. What Advaitins would say to that would be, suppose you were dreaming and you saw Swami and Professor, and you saw yourself, and you saw a chimp in a distance, and you saw a piece of rock on the sky and the earth, and when you woke up, it would be all Robert's mind. The Robert's mind would have become Swami and the Professor and the chimp and the rock and sky in your dreams. That's how Advaita Vedanta sees consciousness.
Thank you, Swamiji. This will be our final question. Prasad, where are you coming from?
I'm from Houston. Namaste, Swamiji, and Namaste, Dr. Goldstein. I'm Prasad and from Houston. Mine is very simple question to Dr. Goldstein. In Advaita Vedanta, once I realize I am Brahman. So on the other side, on the Buddhist side, you have already defined a permanent nirvana or nibbana, wherein, so here, once we realize, is like Buddha, which is enlightened one, right? So, but I understand like it is possible that they're reborn. So like Bodhisattva coming back. So what is the difference between Bodhisattva and Buddha when it compared like Brahman in with Advaita Vedanta?
I'll speak to the Bodhisattva Buddha part as quickly as I can, and please, I would love for Swami to speak to the other side in Advaita. That in Mahayana Buddhism, then a Buddha does not cut off from the suffering world of samsara. A Buddha always remains available and in touch with the suffering, confused beings of samsara. A bodhisattva is simply one on the path to Buddhahood, less than a Buddha. But a Buddha's capacities are much greater than a bodhisattva's, because a Buddha has removed obscurations, blockages that a bodhisattva still has within consciousness. So a Buddha is simply greater than a bodhisattva. Both are committed to remaining with sentient beings until all beings are liberated. So it's understood in Mahayana that a Buddha may take a human body and that human body may die, but the Buddha's deeper body is what is called Dharmakaya, which is all pervasive consciousness, not localized anywhere, which will continue to manifest in different forms to try to help beings. That's part and parcel of what a Buddha is. It's not premeditated. That's just the natural being of awakening. Well, I'll let Swami take the other side of it.
Well, in Advaita Vedanta, one would say Ishvara, Saguna Brahman, God, the God of theistic religions. So God is ever present. God is eternally free and yet ever present to create, preserve, and dissolve the world and help all beings towards enlightenment. And so God's avatars, incarnations, which will be like the Buddha, for example. So God's incarnations are also present to help rest of us towards enlightenment and freedom and take us out of sorrow. And they are also always free, ever free, and yet they are present. You can appeal to them individually. And so are certain perfected beings. Sri Ramakrishna used to call them Ishvara Kotis, who are not incarnations of God, and yet they are all ever free, ever perfect, and yet they maintain individual identities, and you can pray to them and they can come and help, and so on and so forth. Whereas the common run of Jivan Muktas, if you can ever call a Jivan Mukta kind of common, fully liberated beings, once the physical body drops off, the subtle body also goes back to nature, according to the Upanishads, and all individuality is lost, and that Jivan Mukta remains as, the realization is as that one infinite being, which is the ultimate reality anyway. So here is the difference. I think corresponding, if you want to find correspondence, would be the Arhat concept in Theravada Buddhism, which is sort of intermediary in the whole 10 steps of Bodhisattva. And the Bodhisattvas want to remain here, but it's not that they're any lower than Arhats or ever free beings. At one stage in their evolution, Professor can say, they go through that phase, and they are already, highly evolved, very powerful spiritually, and not only free themselves, but they can also help others towards freedom. So there are analogous things, yeah.
Wow. Thank you, everyone. This has been just a beautiful experience of philosophy, of practices and experiences and insights. There was a lot here to digest. And what I'm going to ask is our coordinator, Subir, to upload this into our website so that you guys will have access to this and review this again, because there's a lot of information that came through, and it takes more than sort of one dose to be able to digest it. It may take many viewings. So I want to really thank Dr. Goldstein and Swami Sarvaprinanji both for sharing your time. I mean, it's 11:03 now on the East Coast. Thank you so much for just giving us your knowledge and your wisdom. Maybe in the future, we hope to have you both again, and maybe we can have you here. I know, Dr. Goldstein, sometimes you come to San Diego. I know that. Maybe we can have Swami Sarvaprinanji here. We can have an in-person type of retreat, some type of thing like that. It'd be wonderful to have you both. I want to thank everyone so much for participating in the wonderful questions. And thank you so much.
I want to thank the Swami for making all this happen. And there's a unique talent he has, his enthusiasm and his organizational abilities and his delight in philosophy and spiritual practices. Well, his delight in being, in human beings, that's
likewise, and I have to say, he came to Harvard and he just exemplified open-mindedness and a real willingness to then learn and pivot in new ways that, to me, I still find it inspiring. So you're a really great example for me and others, Swami.
You're a great, wonderful teacher. I just spent so much time after class with Dr. Goldstein, and he was just generous with his time, just a wealth of knowledge. And because Swami Sarvaprinanda had gone to Harvard the year before, he opened up a lot of doors for Vedantic monks that we were appreciated. So thank both of you for everything. I just want to, if you guys want to, Subir, can we allow everybody to just, before we go, Dr. Goldstein, would you like to close us off? We started with the Vedantic prayer. Would you like to close us off with the Buddhist prayer? You're muted, Dr. Goldstein.
Sure, I'm going to share screen.
Sure. Okay.
And I'm going to go to the end where I have some closing thoughts. So I'll just read this. It's not exactly a prayer, but a type of reminder. So again, this is from this important master within this Nyingma tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. At all times and in all situations, let whatever you do accord with the sacred Dharma. Dedicate all virtue toward enlightenment for the benefit and permanent liberation of all beings. If you do so, you will fulfill the vision of your teachers and be of service to spirituality. You will repay the kindness of your parents for giving you the opportunity for inner development and for all else. You will spontaneously benefit yourself and others. Please keep this in mind.
Thank you so much, Dr. Goldstein. As a parting, if you guys would like to show your appreciation by just saying thanks, I'm going to I'm going to see if we can unmute everybody. Subir, can we unmute everybody? And just if you'd like to say thank you, just yell out thank you to everybody.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Pranam Swami.
Thank you so much.